Star Wars Episode 1 The Phantom Menace Chapter 2 Do you have any idea what this is going to cost me, boy? Do you have any idea at all? Oba chica! Watto hovered before him, launching into Huttese without even thinking about it, choosing a language that offered a vast array of insulting adjectives he could draw upon. Anakin stood stoically in place, his young face expressionless, his eyes fastened on the pudgy blue Toydarian hovering before him. Watto's wings were a blur of motion, beating with such ferocity it seemed as they must surely fly off his lumpy little body. Anakin stifled an urge to laugh as he imagined this happening. It would not do to laugh just now. When Watto paused for breath, Anakin said quietly, "It wasn't my fault. Sebulba flashed me with his port fence and nearly smashed me into meta drop. He cheated." Watto's mouth worked as if chewing something, his snout wrinkling over his protruding teeth. "Of course he cheated, boy. He always cheats. That's how he wins. Maybe you should cheat just a little now and then. Maybe then you wouldn't crash your pod time after time and cost me so much money." They were standing in Watto's shop, in the merchant's district of Mosespa, a dingy mud and sand hut, from an enclosure packed with rocket and engine parts salvaged from scrapped and junked wrecks. It was cool and shadowy inside, the planet's heat shut out by thick walls, but even here dust hung in the air in hazy streamers caught by the ambient light cast by glow lamps. The race had long since ended, and the planet's twin suns had dropped toward the horizon with evening's slow approach. The wrecked pod racer and its engines had been transported by mechanic droids from the flats back to the shop. Anakin had been transported back as well, though with somewhat less enthusiasm. "Rasatui kopat pendunko!" Watto screamed, starting in again on Anakin in a fresh burst of Huttese. The pudgy body lurched forward a few centimeters with each epithet, causing Anakin to step back in spite of his resolve. Watto's bony arms and legs gestured with the movements of his head and body, giving him a comical appearance. He was angry, but Anakin had seen him angry before, and knew what to expect. He did not cringe or bow his head in submission. He stood his ground, and took his scolding unflinchingly. He was a slave, and Watto was his master. Scoldings were part of life. Besides, Watto would wind down shortly now, his anger released in a manner that would satisfy his need to cast blame in a direction other than his own, and things would go back to normal. All three fingers of Watto's right hand pointed at the boy. "I shouldn't let you drive for me anymore." "That's what I should do. I should find another driver." "I think that is a very good idea," Shmi agreed. Anakin's mother had been standing to one side, not saying anything during the whole of Watto's diatribe. But now she was quick to take advantage of a suggestion she would have made herself, if asked. Watto wheeled on her, spinning violently, wings whirring, and flew to confront her. But her calm, steady gaze brought him up short, hitting him in the air midway between mother and son. "It's too dangerous in any case," she continued, reasonably. "He's only a boy." Watto was immediately defensive. "He's my boy, my property, and he'll do what I want him to do." "Exactly." Shmi's dark eyes stared out of her worn, lined face with resolution. "Which is why he won't race anymore if you don't want him to. Is that what you just said?" Watto seemed confused by this. He worked his mouth and trunk-like nose in a rooting manner, but no words would come out. Anakin watched his mother appreciatively. Her lank, dark hair was beginning to gray, and her once graceful movements had slowed. But he thought she was beautiful and brave. He thought she was perfect. Watto advanced on her for another few centimeters, then stopped once more. Shmi held herself erect in the same way that Anakin did, refusing to concede anything to her condition. Watto regarded her sourly for a moment more, then spun around and flew at the boy. "You will fix everything you ruined, boy," he snapped, shaking his finger at Anakin. "You will repair the engines in the pod and make them as good as new. Better than new, in fact. And you'll start right now. Right this instant. Get out there and get to work." He spun back towards Shmi defiantly. "Still plenty of daylight for a boy to work. Time is money." He gestured at first mother and then son. "Get on with it, both of you. Back to work, back to work." Shmi gave Anakin a warm smile. "Go on, Anakin," she said softly. "Dinner will be waiting." She turned and went out the door. Watto, after giving Anakin a final withering glance, followed after her. Anakin stood in the shadowed room for a moment, staring at nothing. He was thinking that he shouldn't have lost the race. Next time, and there would be a next time, if he knew Watto, he wouldn't. Sighing in frustration, he turned and went out the back of the shop, into the yard. He was a small boy, even at 9 years of age, rather compactly built, with a mop of sandy hair, blue eyes, a pug nose, and an inquisitive stare. He was quick and strong for his age, and he was gifted in ways that constantly surprised those around him. He was already an accomplished driver in the pod races, something no human of any age had ever been before. He was gifted with building skills that allowed him to put together almost anything. He was useful to Watto in both areas, and Watto was not one to waste his slave's talent. But what no one knew about him, except his mother, was the way he sensed things. Frequently he sensed them before anyone knew they would happen. It was like a stirring in the air, a whisper of warning, a suggestion that no one else could feel. It had served him well in the pod races, but it was also there at other times. He had an affinity for recognizing how things were or how they ought to be. He was only 9 years old, and he could already see the world in ways most adults never would. For all the good it was doing him just at the moment. He kicked at the sand in the yard and crossed to the engines and pod the droids dumped there earlier. Already his mind was working on what it would take to make them operable again. The right engine was almost untouched, if he ignored the scrapes and tears in the metal skin. The left was a mess, though, and the pod was battered and bent, the control panels at shambles. "Fidget," he muttered softly. "Just fidget." Mechanical droids came out at his beckoning, and set to work removing the damaged parts of the racer. He was only minutes into sorting through the scrap when he realized that there were parts he needed that Watto did not have on hand, including thermal varostats and thruster relays. He would have to trade for them from one of the other shops before he could start on a reassembly. Watto would not like that. He hated asking for parts from other shops, insisting that anything worth having he already had, unless it came from off-world. The fact that he was trading for what he needed didn't seem to take the edge off his rancor at having to deal with the locals. He'd rather win what he needed in a pod race, or simply steal it. Anakin looked skyward, where the last of the day's light was beginning to fade. The first stars were coming out, small pinpricks against the deepening black of the night sky. Worlds he had never seen and could only dream about awaited out there, and one day he would visit them. He would not be here forever. Not him. "Psst, Anakin!" a voice whispered cautiously to him from the deep shadow at the back of the yard, and a pair of small forms slipped through the narrow gap at the fence corner where the wire had failed. It was Kitster, his best friend, creeping into view with Wald, mother friend, following close behind. Kitster was small and dark, his hair cut in a close ball about his head, his clothing loose and nondescript, designed to preserve moisture and deflect heat and sand. Wald, trailing uncertainly, was a Rodian, an off-worlder who had come to Tatooine only recently. He was several years younger than his friends, but bold enough that they let him hang around with them most of the time. "Hey Annie, what are you doing?" Kitster asked, glancing around doubtfully, keeping a wary eye out for Watto. Anakin shrugged. Watto says I have to fix the pod up again and make it like new. Yeah, but not today, Kitster advised solemnly. Today's almost over. Come on. Tomorrow's soon enough for that. Let's go get a ruby blail. It was their favorite drink. Anakin felt his mouth water. I can't. I have to stay and work on this until... He stopped. Until dark, he was going to say, but it was nearly dark already. So, what will we buy them with? He asked doubtfully. Kitster motioned towards Waldo. He's got 5 druggets he says he found somewhere or other. He gave Wald a sharp look. He says, got him right here, I do. Wald's strange scaly head nodded assurance, his protruding eyes blinking hard. He pulled on one green ear. Don't you believe me? Wald said in Huttese. Yeah, we believe you, Kitster winked at Anakin. Come on, let's go before old Flapping Wings gets back. They went out through the gap in the fence and down the road behind, turned left, and hurried through the crowded plaza toward the food stores just ahead. The streets were still crowded, but the traffic was all headed homeward or to the Hutt pleasure dens. The boys zipped smoothly through knots of people and carts, past speeders hovering just off the surface, down walks beneath awnings in the process of being drawn up, and along stacks of goods being set under lock and key. In moments, they had reached a shop that sold ruby blails, and had worked their way up the counter. Wald was as good as his word, and he produced the requisite druggets in exchange for 3 drinks and handed one to each of his friends. They took them outside, sipping at the gooey mixture through straws, and made their way slowly back down the street, chatting among themselves about racers and speeders and mainline ships, about battle cruisers and starfighters and the pilots who captained them. They would all be pilots one day, they promised each other, and a vow they sealed with spit and hand slaps. They were right in the middle of a heated discussion over the merits of starfighters when a voice close to them said, Give me the choice. I take a Z-95 Headhunter every time. The boys turned as one. An old spacer stood leaning on a speeder hitch, watching them. They knew what he was right away from his clothing, weapons, and the small worn fighter course insignia he wore stitched to his tunic. It was a Republic insignia. You didn't see many of those on Tatooine. Saw you race today, the old spacer said to Anakin. He was tall and lean and corded, his face weather-worn and sun-browned, his eyes an odd color of gray, his hair cut short, so that it bristled from his scalp, his smile ironic and warm. What's your name? Anakin Skywalker, Anakin told him uncertainly. These are my friends, Kitster and Wald. The old spacer nodded wordlessly at the other two, keeping his eyes fixed on Anakin. You fly like your name, Anakin. You walk the sky like you own it. You show promise. He straightened and shifted his weight with practiced ease, glancing from one boy to the next. You want to fly the big ship someday? All 3 boys nodded as one. The old spacer smiled. There's nothing like it. Nothing. Flew all the big boys once upon a time when I was younger. Flew everything there was to fly, in and out of the corps. You recognize the insignia, boys? Again they nodded. Interested now, caught up in the wonder of corning face to face with a real pilot, not just of pod racers, but of fighters and cruisers and mainland ships. It was a long time ago, the spacer said, his voice suddenly distant. I left the Corps 6 years back, too old. Time passes you by, leaves you to find something else to do with what's left of your life. He pursed his lips. How are those ruby blails? Still good? Haven't had one in years. Maybe now's a good time. You boys care to join me? Care to drink a ruby blail with an old pilot of the Republic? He didn't have to ask twice. He took them back down the street to the shop they had just left, and purchased a second drink for each of them, and one for himself. They went back outside to a quiet spot off the plaza, and stood sipping at the blails, and staring up at the sky. The light was gone, and stars were sprinkled all over the darkened firmament. a wash of silver specks nestled against the black. Flew all my life, the old spacer advised solemnly, eyes fixed on the sky. Flew everywhere I could manage, and you know what? I couldn't get to 100th of what's out there. Couldn't get to a millionth. But it was fun trying. A whole lot of fun. His gaze shifted to the boys again. Flew a cruiser filled with Republic soldiers into Macante during its rebellion. That was a scary business. Flew Jedi Knights once upon a time, too. Jedi? Kid held sharply. Wow, really? You really flew Jedi? Anakin pressed, eyes wide. The spacer laughed at their wonder. Cross my heart and call me bantha fodder if I'm lying. It was a long time ago, but I flew 4 of them to a place I'm not supposed to talk about even now. Told you, I've been everywhere a man can get to in one lifetime. Everywhere. I want to fly ships to those worlds one day, Anakin said softly. Wald snorted doubtfully. You're a slave, Annie. You can't go anywhere. The old pilot looked down at Anakin. The boy couldn't look at him. Well, he said softly, in this life you're often born one thing and die another. You don't have to accept that what you're given when you come in, it's all you have when you leave. He laughed suddenly. Reminds you of something. I flew the Kessel Run once long ago. Not many have done that and lived to tell about it. Lots told me I couldn't do it, told me not to bother trying, to give it up and go on to somewhere else. But I wanted that experience, so I just went ahead and found a way to prove them wrong. He looked down at Anakin. Could be that's what you'll have to do, young Skywalker. I've seen how you handle a pod racer. You've got the eyes for it, the feeling. You're better than I was, twice your age. He nodded solemnly. You want to fly the big ships? I think maybe you will. He stared at the boy, and Anakin stared back. The old spacer smiled and nodded slowly. Yep, Anakin Skywalker. I do think maybe one day you will. He arrived home late for dinner and received his second scolding of the day. He might have tried making something up about having to stay late for Watto, but Anakin Skywalker did not lie to his mother. Not about anything, not ever. He told her the truth about stealing away with Kitster and Wald, about drinking Ruby Blales, and about sharing stories with the old spacer. Shmi wasn't impressed. She didn't like her son spending time with people she didn't know, even though she understood how boys were and how capable Anakin was of looking after himself. If you feel the need to avoid the work you've been given by Watto, come see me about the work that needs to be doing here at the home, she advised him sternly. Anakin didn't argue with her, smart enough by now to realize that arguing in these situations seldom got him anywhere. He sat quietly, eating with his head down, nodding when nodding was called for, thinking that his mother loved him and was worried for him, and that made her anger and frustration with him all right. Afterward, they sat outside on stools in front of the home in the cool night air and looked up at the stars. Anakin liked sitting at night before bed. It wasn't so close and confined as it was inside. He could breathe out here. His home was small and shabby and packed tight against dozens of others. Its thick walls comprised of a mixture of mud and sand. It was typical quarters provided for slaves in this part of Mos Espa, a hut with a central room and 1 or 2 bunk pads for sleeping. But his mother kept it neat and clean, and Anakin had his own room, which was rather larger than most and where he keeps his stuff. A large workbench and tools looked up most of the available space. Right now he was engaged in building a protocol droid to help his mom. He was adding the needed parts a piece at a time, scavenging for them wherever he could, slowly restoring the whole. Already, it could talk and move about and do a few things. He would have it up and running soon. Are you tired, Annie? His mother asked after a long silence. He shook his head. Not really. Still thinking about the race? Yes. And he was. But mostly he was thinking about the old spacer and his tales of flying mainland ships to distant worlds, of going into battle for the Republic, and of rubbing shoulders with Jedi Knights. I don't want you racing pods anymore, Annie, his mother said softly. I don't want you to ask Water to let you. Promise me you won't. He nodded reluctantly. I promise. He thought about it a moment. But what if Watto tells me I have to, Mom? What am I supposed to do then? I have to do what he tells me. So if he asks, I have to race. She reached over and put a hand on his arm, patting him gently. I think maybe after today he won't ask again. He'll find someone else. Didn't say so, but he knew his mother was wrong. There wasn't anyone better than he was at pod racing. Not even Sebulba, if he couldn't cheat. Besides, Watto would never pay to have someone else drive when he could have Anakin do it for free. Watto would stay mad another day or two, and then begin to think about winning again. Anakin would be back in the pod races before the month was out. He gazed skyward, his mother's hand resting lightly on his arm, and he thought about what it would be like to be out there, flying battle cruisers and fighters, traveling to far worlds and strange places. He didn't care what Wald said. He wouldn't be a slave all his life, just as he wouldn't always be a boy. He would find a way to leave Tatooine. He would find a way to take his mother with him. His dreams whirled through his head as he watched the stars, a kaleidoscope of bright images. He imagined how it would be. He saw it clearly in his mind, and it made him smile. One day, he thought, seeing the old spacer's face in the darkness before him, the wry smile in Strange Gray's eyes. I'll do everything you've done. Everything. He took a deep breath and held it. I'll even fly with Jedi Knights. Slowly he exhaled, the promise sealed.